Hey y'all, welcome back. I am going to show you today how I made this little short looping animation of Crystal. So I started off in Procreate, as always, because I really just like the line brush that I use. And so I just sketch out the basic sketch and color it. I know that I'm not going to be able to shade the final version as well as what I do here, but I also wanted just a finalized version for myself because I really like this look and I may use it somewhere else. But just kind of figuring out the pose that I want to do. And when I animate every single time, I always figure out the first or the last pose to completion. And sometimes I do both. It really just depends on the mood. But in this case, I'm trying to finalize what this thing looks like when it stops moving. And so it has to be a really strong, dynamic pose for me. And I wasn't exactly sure how I wanted to animate it, but I always like when people drop into the frame in a cool way, so that's what I decided to do. And here I'm working in RoughAnimator. It's a few dollars on the iPad, I think maybe 10, and I've downloaded this years ago, so it may have completely changed, but you can do it for the computer or the iPad, and it's much better than Procreate's built-in animation thing because, as you can see on the top, I can do layers. So I started by pasting my final artwork in that I had done, and what I'm doing here is I'm starting to flesh out kind of the dropping motion. And I'm not going to go crazy in depth here, but I work at 12 frames per second generally because I don't have the patience, ability, whatever, to animate at 24 frames per second. So when you animate in 12, instead of doing instead of doing two drawings, you're basically only doing one and you're just holding it for 2 frames. It's just a faster way, and a lot of times I feel like my animations are smoother because when I move into 24 frames per second, I can't quite get my lines to look as fluid, so using less lines makes it maybe a little more choppy, but also at the same time a little more fluid because I can just do more precise lines instead of trying to find the exact center point between, 2 frames. And the way that I animate is basically kind of straightforward. Like, I will start at the topmost pose, especially in a drop pose, and I will just animate down. Now when we go to the tail, I kind of do that, but I also kind of will skip a couple frames in between. So I may do frame 10 and then frame 16, and then I'll find the center point of those two and break that one down. So it's kind of a modified, like, I wouldn't say that I do keyframe animation, I wouldn't say I do straightforward animation. I do kind of what works for me, and that's kind of just like feeling it out and seeing exactly how I think everything should work instead of just like going from one end to the other. Now, if I was drawing something that I was throwing, or I was, I don't know, doing something very fluid like a tail following, I would do follow through. But here, I'm basically just kind of pose to pose with a little bit of follow through. And something that really helps your animations come to life is animating multiple points that are moving. So here the tail kind of moves, the trident moves, and the hair moves. And that's just to take away from people like staring too hard in one portion of your image. I'm not a perfect artist, so I kind of need those crutches, and it also adds a lot to your finished animation. Like, the more parts that you have moving, the more complex your animation seems. But honestly, the reason that you do that is so people don't focus on one area. And you can see, so like here, I've drawn the lower pose and the standing up pose, and I'm trying to figure out something in between the two to get to that next pose. And I'm not trying to show you a tutorial on how to do this. It's just kind of how I do it, and maybe we'll pick up some traits from what I kind of learned. And it's really all about looking at your proportions, and you'll see that I'm always playing through to see the arcs. And this is basically, anyway, what I'm trying to figure out, like when a knee bends. I always have like a arc that I draw. So I know that, like, okay, if this knee raises, that this knee goes along this arc. And it's a principle of animation, but it really helps in your drawing. If you can't figure something out, figure how that thing moves in space. And it's not only going to help your animation, but it's also going to help your basic drawing. And I know we talked about some of the earlier ones, like when I can't figure out how feet should look in perspective, I just break it down into basic shapes and I start rotating it or I start sliding it. And that's all you're doing in animation, is moving it, right? And so the hair, you can see right there, I was just doing the hair. And basically, to create a convincing animation, you want things to move at different speeds. So for me, the hair's really kind of just like a clump, and so it just kind of drops. The tail, on the other hand, is a combination between part of it weighs a lot, and part of it is kind of just like, woo. And I do that because I want there to be weight. I want there to be realism. And it doesn't have to move realistically, right? You're just trying to accomplish movement. And so you're trying to basically make things move in the most realistic way, even though it might not be realistic. And the way that I work, and you can see that I've kind of named these like body, head, feet. And I start with the things that move the least. So the feet basically only move until they hit the ground and they don't move again. So I drew the line art for the feet first. And then I might have, I think, done the body first, or no, I did the head, and then I did the body, and then I did the tail, because I want things that are crucial to happen first. Like the grounding of the feet has to happen, and the head kind of helps show where things are in perspective, like where the body needs to crunch. And so I just continue fleshing those things out. And here you can see I've come back into Procreate and I've started coloring because I still wasn't sure exactly how much shading and stuff I was going to do. So I wanted that ability to color like I always do in Procreate. And I'm just going through each layer. I find that coloring animation is faster if you stick to one color and work your way through. And I may have just like selected a color and pasted it on similar frames and cleaned it up. But you kind of have to stick to a color because it's just so much faster, and you don't think it is when you're working. You're thinking like, oh, like let me color all this. But it also helps with consistency, right? Because you can see those shapes and see those colors. Here I'm just adding the final touches. I'm adding highlights and sparkles. I realize the sparkles still aren't enough to make me feel good about how bright this thing is. So I just take a quick brush and I brush over some brighter red highlights so that it feels like the fabric is sparkling from different lights. And that's basically it. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. If you have any questions about animation or just drag in general or anything, leave them in the comments. I try to answer all comments on every platform. I'm on Patreon, Twitter, and Instagram as WorkZine. So thanks so much for joining me. I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.